Murder Stories. Story 1. In the Edinburgh neighbourhood of Claremont, Scotland, on Christmas Day, an elderly apartment block resident, Alan Williamson, heard a loud banging on the front door of his apartment. He was reluctant to answer, and understandably so, as he had experienced considerable trouble with a neighbour over the past 6 months. But given the day, and how lonely it can be for some elderly people on the most festive day of the year, Alan decided to take a chance and open the door. Unfortunately, the only thing that greeted Alan when he opened the door was death. The person waiting on the other side set upon him with a 6-inch kitchen knife, stabbing him 29 times in an attack that ended with Alan lying lifeless in a pool of his own blood inside his own apartment. Other residents of the apartment block heard a commotion coming from Alan's apartment and quickly contacted the police. Officers arrived to find Alan Williamson dead in his apartment, with a trail of blood leading from his home to another apartment in the same complex. They followed the blood and knocked on the apartment where the trail ended, finding the door unlocked. Inside, they discovered 37-year-old Melissa Young in a state of frenzy, covered in blood. When the officers asked Melissa if she had just stabbed the man in the apartment across from her, they were amazed to hear her reply affirmatively, stating, "The power it gave me was amazing." She was promptly arrested and taken to a nearby police station for questioning. During her interview, Melissa admitted to killing Alan, blaming him for provoking the attack. She explained that she was enraged because he had professed not liking a Christmas present she had bought for him, a pair of sneakers he found objectionable due to the colors. Melissa had tried to explain that the colors were unisex, but Alan insisted he did not like them and suggested she keep the sneakers. The rejection simmered in her for days until it boiled over, leading to the murder on December 25th. A subsequent toxicology report revealed that Melissa had traces of 4 different illegal drugs in her system, as well as a blood alcohol content that would have made it illegal for her to drive. During her trial, a doctor testified that Melissa was an alcoholic prone to dangerous and violent outbursts. The doctor also explained that Melissa inhaled solvents daily, was on 14 different prescription drugs, and had even smoked heroin on the morning she murdered Alan. It also emerged during the trial that Melissa had been violently harassing Alan for some time. Earlier in the year, she had abducted and assaulted him, believing falsely that he had stolen her house keys. Alan was held at knife point for several hours, only escaping by jumping from the first-floor balcony of her apartment when Melissa turned her back for a moment. At the end of her trial, Melissa was sentenced to serve at least 20 years before being eligible for parole. The judge rejected her plea for a reduced sentence, despite Melissa's claims that the Archangel Saint Michael had taken over her body to punish an unclean demon. The judge stated that while Melissa had a severe personality disorder, it played no part in the murder, and noted that she showed no remorse. In June of that year, while being held for her trial at a women's prison, Melissa was convicted of assault after attacking and biting a female prison officer so hard that it drew blood. As a result, she was sentenced to an additional 6 months of imprisonment. In the aftermath of Melissa's conviction, a Scottish newspaper secured an interview with her former boss, who had employed her at an adult sauna. He spoke of her troubled childhood and descent into violence, crime, addiction, and religious mania. He had to fire her after discovering she had stolen from her clients, but they remained friends. The former boss stated that he felt extremely lucky not to have suffered the same fate as Alan Williamson after being forced to let her go. The interview painted a picture of a highly disturbed person whose poor mental health was exacerbated by habitual use of hard drugs and alcohol. Someone so disconnected from any sense of human decency that they would murder a person over a Christmas present. Perhaps this Christmas we should all be a little more grateful for the gifts we receive. You never know who might take rejection to heart and plot a terrible, bloody revenge. Story 2. It was an early Easter morning at the Davids household. People were getting ready to have a gathering at their homes, and kids were especially excited for the Easter festivities to begin. Georgina had set up a table for all the kids with eggs assembled and paint set, ready to paint the eggs however they liked. She looked forward to all the different ideas the kids in the house would share with her. Paul and Cliff were already out, arranging the barbecue and a little PlayStation for the kids that were going to arrive. Georgina was busy preparing all the food and arranging the snacks and drinks. Malcolm, the youngest of the 3 brothers, hadn't arrived yet. He was a detective. The Davids family in the suburb of New York was an upbeat, big joint family of 3 brothers and their families, and the house was always filled with the noises of children. The suburban American lifestyle that everybody wanted was achieved by the Davids. Malcolm, the youngest, was a detective at the local police department. Paul was a stockbroker at the New York Stock Exchange, and Cliff was an investment banker. Paul and Cliff were bringing in a lot of money, which initially allowed them to move to the suburbs. Georgina, their only sister, was probably the kindest of all. She was a teacher at a local school and was highly regarded in the community due to her behavior. The Davids were highly regarded in the area and helped out everyone whenever they had the chance. It was rare for someone in their position to be this kind, and people around them were happy. Paul and Cliff, both divorced, had custody of their children, and some even say that Cliff used some contacts to win custody, but nothing bad was said about them because of their kindness and constant help to the community. They were holding the annual Easter egg hunt in their backyard and were very excited about it. A lot of children from the local community were there, all excited to see all the fun activities the Davids had planned. All the kids that entered were provided with a bib to keep things running smoothly. A big lunch for everyone in town was arranged, and everyone mingled and talked about anything and everything. Many kids were egg hunting and enjoying the event. When all the kids were called to the front gate, a number of them lined up with all the eggs they had found. Every single kid was there, but there was no sign of Paul's son and Cliff's son. They went to look for them, thinking they might still be egg hunting. They looked everywhere, but there was no sign of the boys within the radius of the event. They decided to call the police, and the event was brought to a halt. Every guest was thoroughly questioned, and no one knew anything about the boys. The police were scared about losing light, knowing that once it got dark, it would become difficult to find the children. Then one of the kids who was egg hunting with the boys told the police that a big rabbit took both boys with him. Malcolm decided to take the lead on the case and officially declared it a kidnapping. He knew that every moment was precious, so he called for a search and issued a judge-signed order to search the area within a 10-kilometer radius and even arrest anyone dressed in a rabbit suit. Many people were dressed as rabbits, including a local boy who was dressed as a rabbit at their party. Malcolm started to interrogate him, and the boy explained that he couldn't have kidnapped the boys since he was at the party the whole time. By logic, Malcolm agreed. The boy acknowledged Malcolm's tense situation. Paul and Cliff were keeping this under wraps for now and didn't want the press involved, so they kept checking in with Malcolm on the progress. The search team had no updates, and the forest area was being searched thoroughly. Paul didn't want his wife to get involved, so he never told her about the kidnapping. Cliff, on the other hand, decided to call his wife. She was scared and angry and pleaded for Malcolm to find the boys soon. Malcolm was losing light, so he called in reinforcements and decided to do an air search over the forest. The search was unsuccessful, and it started raining, making the forest even more difficult to search. The search was not called off. Everyone in town was willing to look for the kids regardless of the weather. As time went on, the search was put on hold. Everyone returned from the forest search, and the community stood by their side, willing to do everything possible. The night passed, and everyone was still wide awake, doing everything they could. Malcolm decided to run through every dress vendor in the block to see all the rabbit costume rentals. One by one, they started interrogating everyone who had a rabbit costume, but there was no luck. Everyone's alibi checked out, and there was no clue as to who the giant rabbit was. They decided to do another full sweep of the house, and surprisingly, in the basement, they found another rabbit costume. They sent it to forensics to get the prints, which didn't match anyone in the system. So, the next suspects were the people in the house that day. There were only 3 people with access to the basement: Paul, Georgina, and Malcolm. None of them seemed to be suspects, but Malcolm decided to get everyone's prints. But 3 days passed with no clue as to where the kids were. They waited for the results on the prints from the costume found in the basement. It wasn't a match, meaning there was a 4th person in the basement. They were clueless about the intruder. In a surprising turn of events, one of the dry cleaners who rented the rabbit costume noticed an irregularity in his ledger. He said that the guy who was the Easter rabbit at David's party had rented out 2 different costumes. Malcolm showed the photographic evidence of the costume found in the basement, and the shopkeeper confirmed it was the same costume. Malcolm was pissed that he had let the man slip right through his fingers. They put an APB on the man and issued a nationwide arrest warrant. 3 days later, the guy was found in an alleyway in a completely different state, planning to escape the country. He was questioned after being brought in and agreed to have kidnapped the children, but he said he handed the children to a woman. The description of the woman matched that of Paul's wife. Their doubt became clear. And maybe this was why she never called back when Paul tried to inform her about the lost children. Malcolm took a SWAT team and decided to raid her house, but to his surprise, the house was empty. The case twisted even more. They brought in surveillance tapes from every bus station, railway station, and airport to see if they ever left the state, but there was no luck. Paul suggested Malcolm look for them at the family cabin in the forest up north. They moved, and it turned out to be a lead. There was no one there, but the ash in the fireplace seemed recent. Malcolm ordered an aerial thermal search of the area to detect any heat signatures. 2 hours after the big search, the helicopter picked up 3 heat signals from inside the river. Their biggest fear was coming alive. The rescue team and paramedics were called. After an hour, the body of one female, matching the description of Paul's wife, was found tied to that of 2 boys, who matched the description of both Paul's son and Cliff's son. Their legs were tied to bricks. They were drained of blood from previously inflicted wounds, and later reports revealed that the kids were dead before they were drowned. The woman, however, died from drowning. The suicide note was found, blaming Paul for the suicide. Paul couldn't bear the pain and was found hanging in his room a day later. Cliff was destroyed, and the Davids were not the same happy family they once were. Malcolm turned to drinking, failed throughout his career, and was later suspended. The terrible suicide devastated the family, or so it seemed, until the same case was called in on Easter the following year. This time, it was the Fellers. What seemed like a suicide was now a case of a serial killer. The case of the Davids reopened, and Malcolm was put back on the case. This is how the story of the Easter Bunny killer started. Story 3. So back in 2015, I was a freshman in high school. One weekend, I went to my friend Andrew's house to meet up with other friends to go into DC. We had a great time in DC, but now it was getting dark outside, so we all started getting back on one of the trains. At first, it was all nothing unnerving until we stopped at the Bethesda station and 4 guys came in, singing obnoxiously loud and trying to intimidate people on the train. One of my friends, Gabby, was starting to get a bit scared. The loud singing woke up my friend Andrew, who immediately knew something was up, as did all my other friends. The final stop where we got off was the stop. The 4 guys got off as well, but they were ahead of us, so we thought that it was over. After that, we started heading toward the parking lot, but my friend's mom wasn't there to pick us up, so we all stood there to wait. We were all talking in a circle, then out of the blue, the 4 loud guys from earlier were walking towards us, but with more people this time. This now big group of people was walking around us, encircling us, trying to intimidate us. We didn't know what was going to happen, so we all stood there just to wait for them to make the first move. This group started another intimidation tactic, which was starting to low-key scare my friend Gabby and Kimmy, but we all didn't make the first move. They broke into our social circle and were getting close to all of us. Nevin was stepping on some of our shoes, and one of them said, "See, I like reading books." My friend Andrew was slowly pulling out, trying to hide the fact that he was pulling out a knife, and so was I, but one of them saw it. We were expecting a fight to start, but thankfully, they all realized this possible robbery attempt might not be easy, because some of us weren't going to go without a fight. Thankfully, they all started heading away, but it was still a very unnerving experience. About a week later, a local news station posted on Twitter that a man was beaten to death and robbed at the same metro station. I still wonder to this day if that was the same group of people we had encountered